everybody, and welcome. My name is Andy Purvis. I'm Director, Sustainable Manufacturing with the World Steel Association. We are delighted to be partnering with ISN today on this webinar. One thing before we hand over, I just wanted to talk for a few minutes about World Steel Safety Program and really why we are focusing on this topic. As some leaders within the global steel industry, over the last few years, we've focused on different aspects of safety management with our industry in order to try and focus on the key risks. So last year, we ran a series of webinars concerned with gassing and asphyxiation. The year before, we ran a selection of webinars looking at issues around working at height and falling from heights. This year, we are partnering with ISN in order to deliver a series of 4 webinars over the next few months focused on contractor management. And it's, I think, reasonable to ask the question, why are we focusing on contractor management? Well, this Sunday, just gone, as I speak today, was World Steel Day for Safety and Health. And on that day, we released our annual data report, which looks at the performance, the issues and the risks faced by the global steel industry of World Steel's members. If you just look at the number of fatal accidents we had reported to us at World Steel last year, we had 61 fatal incidents recorded and reported to us. Of those, 40 were related to contractors. So the contractor community within our industry, I think, is very much a vulnerable community. They're at higher risk, and they're suffering disproportionately from serious accidents and, unfortunately, from fatalities. So this contractor management is an absolutely critical issue, and I'm delighted today to be launching this series of webinars. Next slide, please, Ryan. I'll stop talking in a moment, but I just wanted to introduce our speaker this morning. So, as I said, the last few years, we've really partnered with subject matter experts to look at the issues that we've been dealing with. Last year, we worked with Draeger, the year before with 3M. This year, when we looked around the world for people who had really lived experience of contractor management within our industry and others, we really landed talking to ISN fairly quickly. So ISN, Ryan will introduce, I'm sure, very well, so I won't try and do that, but I will introduce Ryan. So Ryan is a health and safety environment team lead at ISN, and he leads in his current role a global team of safety and sustainability professionals, and he undertakes with his team review and verification of contractors' documentation, including written policies and all other aspects. The team which he runs has a very keen focus on working with customers, looking at leading indicators, tracking lagging indicators as measures of success, and looking at safety culture within contractor organizations. Ryan, I'm sure you will introduce yourself in a moment. Oh, before I forget, if you have any questions and you would like to ask as they come up through the webinar, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to ask those. That's better than chat because Q&A is captured and chat isn't when the webinar is over. So if you put in your questions into Q&A, you can do that at any point. And at the end of the webinar, the end of the presentation, we'll come back and we can have a bit of a discussion with Ryan and team around the topics that you raise. So that's probably enough from me. I will hand over, Ryan, over to you. And thank you and good luck with the presentation.
Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that. And one last administrative or housekeeping item is this is being recorded. So you'll have access to all of this later, kind of as an on-demand thing, and be able to reflect back on some of the things that we're talking about. So I do appreciate everybody joining today. Happy belated World Safety Day, everyone. I always think it's good to take a moment to reflect on what it means to be a safety professional in today's world, in today's environment, and really think about why we do what we do. But like Andy said, my name is Ryan Rodriguez. I'm one of the certified safety professionals here on the health and safety team at ISN Software Company. I've been here for 8 years, and really during my time at the company, I've had the chance to work with many different types of organizations, from your small mom and pops to the large multinationals, and also really in many different industries, steel being just one of the about 30 industries that we support. So quick moment to say thank you to the World Steel Association and Steel University for hosting today, and all of you in the audience for taking that time to join us. Also, a big thank you to Lauren from the ISN team for coordinating and keeping me on track. So, like Andy mentioned, over the course of the next few months, my colleagues and I will be talking about a few things related to safety contractor management, including today's session on just general best practices for contractor management, on-site monitoring, adding layers of due diligence, and then finally we'll close out the year in September with the session on safety culture and benchmarking. Throughout all of those sessions, we're trying to tie it back to that common refrain that many of you are probably familiar with: plan, do, check, and act. As that really does kind of a nice job of capturing what each of us are trying to accomplish on a daily basis in our own roles. So to kind of kick us off today on the topic of contractor management best practices, I wanted to start by giving a very brief background on contractor management and why it matters. So across the globe, there is an industry agnostic trend of outsourcing non-core business activities to third-party contractors. There's many different reasons for this, although cost and risk are at the top of that list. And the steel industry is no different. Data from the World Steel Association does support that claim. Interestingly and sadly, however, there is a higher prevalence and likelihood of serious injuries and fatalities, or SIFs, occurring at the contractor company level when you compare that instead to the employees of the steel companies themselves. And that's what you're seeing in the graph on the left there, which does include the 2023 data, which was very recently released, like Andy said, from the World Steel Association. So the combined fatality frequency rate, or FFR, you can see has been somewhat decreasing over the past 10 years. And in 2023 was almost half of the peak overall rate in 2015. And of course, that's exciting. But again, you're going to notice that the FFR for contractors is almost 2.5 times as high as the employee rate. Of course, this data is from the industry as a whole and not just for one particular company or organization. So your data may look completely different, although I would say it's likely the numbers are probably closer than you might think, just given that many of those contractor organizations do work for the same customers. Now, from that same report from the World Steel, it was identified that the top 5 causes of fatalities over the past decade were falling from heights, moving machinery, on-site road vehicles, falling objects, and gassing asphyxiation. As the consistent causes of fatalities are persisting, it's something that really we should all be considering how we can tackle those hazards to mitigate the risk to as low as reasonably practicable. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of my company, ISN, we provide a contractor management platform called ISNet World. It's a web-based system that captures documentation and other information in many different risk areas, including, of course, HSE, quality, procurement, sustainability, and cyber. We work with over 800 what we call hiring clients or buying organizations worldwide, and we have over 80,000 active contractors and suppliers providing information to those hiring clients. So you'll probably recognize some of the logos on the bottom of the screen that use our system today to track information on their contractors. And really, you can imagine that with so many companies putting data into our system, we have a unique ability to discover and analyze that data to identify any active or upcoming industry trends. We've also been in business for about 23 years now, which means we can also look back to find precursors in the data that just one single business may be not able to do on their own. Now, with all of this data and the years of experience, we have found and summarized in this presentation 10 of the best-in-class contractor management elements that any organization can and should consider as they evaluate their own processes. Now, a reminder, we are recording this. It's going to be available to you on demand. So I just have one slide per element here, but know that each of these really could warrant its own course all by itself. Let's start with number one, having a clear communication strategy. Now, on the webinar, I can't really see if anybody raises their hands, so I'm not going to ask you to do that. But I do want you to think about how every single one of us has had a challenge where our supervisors, our management, or even really our coworkers were not communicating on the same wavelength as us. And maybe that was regarding the goal or purpose of a project. Maybe it was the best way to perform a task, or maybe it's something more basic like why that audit should have been documented instead of verbally recapped. But whenever you're responsible for communicating with your contractors or suppliers, or really anybody for that matter, think about three main things. Number one, start with the what. What is your goal in that communication? Are you telling them about a new expectation? Are you asking them to comply with new rules or wondering what the status is of the audit gaps that you had previously discovered and discussed? But by starting with that what, you're going to get off on the right foot in those communications. Number two, think about how to communicate with them. Now, we all have different styles of learning, right? And with that comes different styles of communication that's necessary. Like, has anybody ever received a phone call from a doctor's office that's confirming an appointment? Most of us probably have, and I'm guessing about half of us thought, "Thank you, knew I should have written that down. Appreciate the confirmation." But the other half of us is thinking, "Why did you just waste my time with a call? I wish you would have just texted me or emailed me," right? You have to think about these different communication styles when you're doing your own outreach. Emails, phone calls, physical mail, handbook signatures, or electronic platform acknowledgments. Really, all of those can get the job done. It just depends on who your audience is. So think about how you're going to communicate with them. And finally, on the communication piece, number three, engagement. Ask for input from your stakeholders. In the ESG or sustainability world, we would call this a materiality assessment, essentially determining what topics are important to your stakeholders, which can include your employees, customers, and the community in which you operate. And that same thing, same mindset can be true here. Find ways to engage with your contractors and suppliers to find out what they appreciate about your processes and what challenges they have with that. We all like to know how we're stacking up. And before we can benchmark, we have to have a system that's designed to measure performance. So probably everyone in this room is familiar with leading and lagging indicators, but just as a very quick definition to align us, lagging indicators are those things that are tracked after an incident, whereas the leading indicators are proactively monitoring and trying to prevent those incidents from occurring in the first place. Now, in the safety world today, it seems that many people and organizations are making the transition to leading indicators within their own organizations. It does go, in my opinion, hand in hand with that shift towards focusing more on SIFs, or the serious injuries and fatalities, like we talked about earlier. With that said, we can't and probably shouldn't, to be fair, get totally away from the lagging indicators. One reason why we can't is just depending on which country or region you operate in, sometimes it's a requirement to report on those metrics. In the United States, OSHA requires electronic submission of specified lagging metrics for many, many organizations, which depends on, of course, the size of the company, but also the industry in which they operate. But that doesn't mean that you and your company have to only focus on lagging indicators. Consider what leading indicators make sense for your company and the culture in which you operate. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you see some examples of what leading indicators could be. But please know this is not a comprehensive list. Each organization will have unique challenges that they're trying to overcome, and they may have different leading indicators for what they're choosing to focus on. But just as a couple of examples, how many trainings are being completed versus how many you expected to be completed? What about any of those inspections or on-site audits that you're doing? If you're using a behavior-based safety system, an observation system, how many observations are you receiving? And are those ones that you're receiving of quality product? And then lastly, perception surveys. One of the common critiques of leading indicators is the fact that they can be hard to track and quantify, which is often true. And yet, hopefully, you can see just there are many different ways that that problem can be addressed to help with a quantitative analysis that can then be used to help benchmark against your peers. Number three, a risk ranking. So one of the best things a company, could do, who's hiring contractors, can create a risk ranking for the companies that are doing work for them. Now, contractors come in so many different sizes, capabilities, and generally different risk profiles. So before you set just a flat standard that says everyone that you pay must fall into the contractor management system with the same requirements, consider classifying the risk that those companies are actually posing to your organization. So build a typical matrix, like the one you see on the screen here, where the x-axis is work location, y-axis is job function, and essentially discover which companies it is that you want to monitor more closely. Hopefully this technique is going to allow you to really draw a line in the sand in a manner that is still fair and consistent. So on this one, the example on the screen, you can see that clerical work is mostly considered low risk, and therefore full monitoring is not necessary, right? If they're working in the office or they're working in their own shop, or really even if they're just doing construction, if it's clerical work, you may not need to engage them with a full-blown monitoring system. However, if that same company is doing the work at one of the plants that you operate, or a production facility instead of a typical office, all of a sudden that risk does become higher, right? Their employees are potentially being exposed to the same thing that every other company on site is potentially being exposed to. So they need to have different measures in place to ensure that they're operating safely and efficiently. And don't forget to reevaluate this process. So every once in a while, companies are going to expand their own operations, right? Instead of just doing, HVAC, now they're also going to take on the electrical work associated with that instead of subcontracting it out, right? And if they do that, all of a sudden their risk ranking may change a little bit. But it's not just those companies who may have a change. It could be that your organization is having a risk tolerance change, which can be varied based on a lot of different factors that go into, what's happening at your own organization, any acquisitions that you've made, any mergers that have happened, or even what you've seen happen with some of your peers or competitors in the landscape today may change kind of your risk tolerance and say you either need more people to be monitored closely or fewer potentially as well. Number four, have a systematic due diligence process. So this slide is taken from a normal presentation that I give, but I like to use it because it does highlight some of the different ways of due diligence that you might focus on. Now, think of this funnel as kind of like a sieve, because some of these items, some of the contractors that you put through the funnel may only need to stop at one of the different levels, right? They don't necessarily need to go all the way to the bottom. Of course, it depends, like we're talking about, on your own risk tolerance. But starting at the top is contractor self-reported data. So that might be things like questionnaires, right? Them just kind of giving you some binary yeses and nos. Do you, as a contractor company, have a health and safety management system? Do you have a full-time health and safety professional on staff? Do you have a competent person for fall protection? Right? All of those things are binary yeses and nos, but what it will do is hopefully give you some insights into being able to say, where do we want to focus our efforts on, right? If we're finding that a majority of the companies that we're working with do not have some sort of management system in place, maybe that's something that we want to focus on to help provide them the resources to develop one. Same thing for any of those other kind of yeses and no questions. If they don't have a fall protection competent person on staff, maybe that alerts you into recognizing the need to provide such an individual on the locations that you're having contracted work being performed at heights, right? So a lot of things that can happen just using a very basic questionnaire. But as you kind of funnel that sieve a little bit more into step two, the desktop review and verification. So this is where you would say, okay, the contractor indicated that yes, they do have a safety management system. Well, in step two, that's saying, well, show us evidence of that, right? Let me see the documentation that shows you've got that policy in place. Think about fall protection, right? Great, they have a fall protection program. Now you want to be able to see that and read through it to understand what their expectations are. Are they identifying the risks before they go on site? Are they conducting training for all of their employees? And how do they know? How are they auditing themselves whether that fall protection is being used appropriately? All of those different things can kind of come just from reading the program itself, right? And having an understanding of what the expectation for that company's employees are when they come onto your facilities. The third step in our funnel is kind of an implementation assessment. At ISN, we call it REVS Plus. You may call it something different. Really, the gist of what's happening in the implementation is assessment is saying, now that I've seen your policy, I want to see it actually play out on site, play out in the field. How do I know that you're actually implementing that documentation? It's one thing to say, great, you're going to wear fall protection whenever work is happening at 6 feet or more above the surface, right? But if you're walking around your sites and you're noticing that contractors are not wearing the fall protection at 6 feet or higher, then there's a gap there, right? There's a potential misunderstanding from either the employees themselves or the company's corporate in terms of training. And there needs to be something to help close that gap, right? If it's not fall protection, maybe it's lockout tagout, right? There's all kinds of different hazards that these folks are facing on a day-to-day basis. And you want to make sure that just because they say that they're doing something on paper, that they're actually doing that when they come onto your location as well. And finally, as you get to kind of that bottom level of the sieve, so that's where you get to any inspections or field audits that you as a hiring client are doing. So you're going through and walking through that documentation process saying, yes, I was able to, confirm that they're doing X, Y, and Z. Yes, I can confirm that they're, performing the right checks that they're supposed to be performing and have done their toolbox talks or whatever it might be on a daily basis, right? Done the risk assessment or hazard identification. So all of this funnel is really just intended to help organizations really monitor their contractor performance. Again, thinking about which level of the sieve each organization might need to fall to based on the type of work that they're doing or the hazards that they face. Number 5, maintaining a qualified contractor list. So if you've never been pressed to get someone now, whether because there's an emergency situation on site or maybe just your boss wants to test your readiness, having a ready-to-go contractor list can really save you. Now, different situations arise every day, as you all know, and sometimes you may have to call a company you haven't talked to in a year or maybe two. But just because you haven't talked to them doesn't mean their risk has gone to nil. It's just as important that they come ready to work and work safely as if they were on your site yesterday. Now, this continuous monitoring that we're discussing helps ensure those organizations are remaining steadfast in their commitment to safety, from maintaining a strong safety record and safety culture to keeping a low experience modifier rate or current insurance requirements, whatever that may be. And it can also help with procurement integrity. And what I mean by that is everyone can have faith in the system, including your procurement and finance teams. And you can have more confidence knowing that the organizations you choose to work with have met and hopefully exceeded all of the expectations that you have. But part of maintaining such a list is providing standardized and transparent guidelines to the companies who are vying to do work for you. The nice thing about these guidelines is they can be whatever you want them to be. Do you have a focus on safety risk this year? Then place an emphasis on serious injuries and fatalities and a company having no regulatory citations or violations. Maybe next year, though, there's a cyber focus due to a competitor suffering a cyber incident. So that year, you want to tweak your guidelines a little bit to focus on organizations having a strong cybersecurity policy and procedures in place. And then the year after that, it's contractual risk or sustainability risk, really whatever it is. Hopefully you get the point that it's adaptable. And all of that is fine. It's great as long as you are being transparent about what you're grading on or against. There's nothing worse than not knowing what standard or expectations you have to live up to. I mean, imagine if you were to go to the doctor's office to have some blood work done, and the doctor tells you, great, you have 1 million red blood cells per microliter. I'm assuming for really everybody in this call, that means absolutely nothing to you. Your next question would be, okay, and, right? But knowing that the average is 4 to 6 million red blood cells per microliter, that's what you need to know. And with that, you can action it by taking, your daily vitamins, or you're going to exercise more, you're going to, avoid aspirins, medications, whatever that might be to actually tackle the issue. And that is the same thing as contractors trying to get to work with you. If they know that they need to have a lower incident rate, right? If that's the metric that they're looking for, then maybe all they need to do is kind of understand what risk mitigation measures are available to them to meet that benchmark or that expectation that you've laid out for them. Now, all of that is kind of the carrot, right? You're giving them something to work for, something to strive for, and just encourage you to kind of focus on the three items that are listed on the right-hand side of the screen here. Number one, use the single, well-organized database. Number two, it has to be easily accessed, managed, and audited. And number three, minimize the duplication and the inefficiencies. If you can kind of meet those three things, you're going to have contractors that are much happier in working with you and working for you. But okay, you've dangled that carrot now, and hopefully many of the contractors that you're working with are getting into compliance. But it's inevitable that some will not. So there has to be a stick as well. Establish, communicate, and enforcing consequences for companies that are not willing to live up to the expectations of your company. Now, enforcement can look different at each organization, but a common theme is probably not too surprising. You just don't give them any work. Of course, sometimes depending on the type of work they do, if it's specialty and the geography in which they operate in, maybe you don't have that option of just not using them. But in those cases, just try to figure out what is the root cause of their noncompliance. Is it a cost thing that maybe you can subsidize as an organization? Is it a lack of time? Maybe it's a culture at their company, and a simple phone call from you or your manager can help kind of talk it out and really figure it out together on what it takes to collaborate with each other to meet the expectations that you set out. But regardless, find out what that root cause is and work with the company to address it fairly. There's also an area here that you may want to involve your legal team in, and that would be the contracts or agreements. If anything is coming up for renewal or it's being re-upped, it may be worth considering adding some sort of verbiage in there to address noncompliance and then the penalties from there. You're not looking to make enemies, but sometimes, writing things down really can solve a world of problems. Now, enforcing these consequences and having an exit strategy is essential. I mean, as an example, if you've got, plan A with contractor A and something happens with them, it doesn't work out, are you and your team ready to shift and to pivot towards plan B and contractor B? And are you ready to do that quickly? Now, in the long run, it will eliminate effort on your end to really focus on managing those challenging performers. Yes, you may have fewer, ready to go companies like we were saying on your qualified contractor list, but again, we hope that you can feel confident in knowing that those companies that are on your list are more likely to be safe and willing to work up to your expectations. Number 8, addressing subcontractor management. So this one probably doesn't come as a surprise, right? We saw with the stats earlier that show how contractor incidents are higher than employee incidents. And that logic does really seem to carry over to the subcontractors as well, right? If you're being further removed in the supply chain, it can provide kind of an extra shroud of secrecy and not necessarily in a good way. So how do you know if the companies that you're hiring are using subcontractors, and how could you limit or prevent that? And one surefire way of telling is if you start seeing company logos on your site that you don't recognize, whether it's hard hats, gang boxes, or really even company vehicles, all of those can give them away. And the biggest way to help try to limit that to only companies that meet your expectations is by having a solid foundation in place for contractor management, right? It's totally normal, absolutely fine for one company to not be able to do everything. They need to contract out some types of work. But those secondary companies that they're outsourcing to should also be qualified and monitored to the same level of standards as the general or the prime contractor that you're working with. If they're coming onto your site, then you have the right and a reason to ensure that proper due diligence has been conducted on those companies. And you can also work with the general contractors to ensure that they have a rigorous process for qualifying the subcontractors. Really, even if that process is using the same systematic approach that you use already. And with that, your systematic approach leads me to number 9. Integrate with internal business practices. Now, contractor management is not something that can be handled by one person on the safety team. It just can't. It takes a village to have a system that's successful and that's being used appropriately and efficiently. So I know as you've kind of listened to me this morning already, you're thinking of all of the different variables that go into qualifying a company. And if you don't already have a system in place, it's probably a bit overwhelming. You're probably wondering, how it's even feasible to account for and balance all of those different variables. That's normal. But use technology to your advantage. Things like your drug and alcohol tests or trainings from third-party providers, contractor licenses to be able to perform work in a specific region. All of those can be combined with your existing audit data, contracts, post-job evaluations, whatever it is, into a contractor management system, which can then be used to export grades like we talked about earlier to your site level contacts, or maybe the insurance statuses to your risk management team. training details to your corporate safety group, or even questionnaire responses to whoever may need it. I think of things like the greenhouse gas emissions from your supply chain may need to be shared with your sustainability or your ESG group. But what determines success of kind of incorporating this into your existing practices? Well, as usual, it's going to depend a little bit on your company and what KPIs you choose. But a couple of ways on the right-hand side of the screen here now, monitoring site entry, ID badge scanning, which ensures that people only have site access if they and their company have been pre-approved, or really even only issuing purchase orders to qualified contractors. And the last one we wanted to share is having a strong safety culture. So for those of you who stay attuned to the current safety, culture that's out there today, talking about initiatives and trends, this is a little bit of a buzzword. And one of the big critiques is that it's hard to define and it's even harder to track. And those are fair criticisms. But hopefully the 5 bullets on this screen can hopefully get you thinking about what it means to have a strong safety culture. Number one, see contractors as partners to promote their ownership and safety. They will often have good ideas or be able to share thoughts with you from their own experiences or customers that they're working for in other areas. Just keeping in mind that safety is not proprietary. Include contractor safety metrics in your company-wide goals. That's definitely one way to get heads turning on your leadership team. Support site mentorship with contractors. Conduct regular meetings with contractors, and then lastly here, conduct a culture assessment and do some benchmarking. There are a number of companies out there that do these types of culture assessments. So look for one that matches your own values and can support you in creating messaging that can be shared with your executive leadership team. Just remember throughout all of this that once you have the data, you have to do something with it, especially if you're collecting it from your frontline employees or contractors. So general contractor management strategy. We, like I mentioned early on in the presentation, have a lot of data available to us, and we do conduct some of our own surveys as well. One of the recent ones we had was with 230 decision makers across 20 industries. Almost 70% of those respondents were director level or above. Now, interestingly, about half of those respondents believed that outsourcing to contractors was going to increase or remain the same over the next 2 years. Speaking of culture, they wanted to improve that safety culture alignment as their number one priority. Almost 60% of the respondents indicated limited internal resources as the number one challenge that they're facing today, and about the same number look to their environmental health and safety groups to lead the contractor management initiatives. So probably a lot of the people on the call here today. Just remember, like I was mentioning, it is not just up to the HSE groups to do this. It does take collaboration and participation from multiple groups at your organization to be successful. I hope you've had a chance to scan that QR code to download, but if you haven't, we'll share it again later. Just some more stats that I wanted to throw at you. 65% have reported that improving safety culture and value alignment are most effective at their companies in driving down those serious injuries and fatalities. And 40% have reported that the shortage of skilled and competent workers is one of their primary external challenges. So keep in mind back to that sieve that we were talking about earlier, step one of just contractor reported data, some of those binary responses. It can be so important for you and your company to evaluate and monitor what some of these just simple yeses and nos can tell you They really can be a story, and it's important to be able to address those where you can and provide support to those companies where you can. This is a really interesting data. There's a lot of stuff on the screen, I know, but I'll kind of drive your attention to a couple of things. So number one, the reason that each bar has three colors is it kind of shows you or demonstrates where those respondents were indicating number one, number two, and number three priority for those organizations' contractor management objectives in the next 1 to 2 years. So fairly quick turnaround time. The one that you'll see 53% of companies indicated as their number one priority was improving the overall safety performance of contractors, including those serious injuries and fatalities. And what's the number one way to improve it is first you have to know what you're getting into, what's your baseline, and then you can set targets to actually reduce or minimize those types of injuries from happening, right? If you don't know or recognize that a majority of your incidents are happening from working at heights or from the gases and asphyxiations, then you don't know where to focus your efforts on. So make sure that you establish a baseline. And then the second one for the number one priority at 48% is improving profitability through reduced costs, rework, and incidents. Now, some of the things here can just be negotiating with your contractors who are doing work for you, right? Maybe as you kind of do a deep dive or analysis into organizations, you'll find that that same company is doing work for you in multiple regions or multiple locations. And you may even have multiple contracts with that company in the different regions. That's not abnormal. It's not unheard of. But if you work with your legal team and their legal team, it's entirely possible that you can negotiate one agreement, one statement of work to allow you to kind of get some sort of discount with them in recognizing that that business relationship is strong and you plan on continuing it. And then lastly, the number one priority at 42% is improving the site safety culture alignment. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, simply focusing on safety culture and how do you evaluate that? Hopefully using one of those perception surveys just to gauge not only what your employees think you're doing and doing well, but what about the contractors that are working for you? What do they see as things that you're doing and doing well? Now, just to kind of close this out, this is a quote that's really resonated with us at ISN, and I hope it resonates with you as well. It's from David Michaels, who's the former Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA in the United States. And he says, really, investing in the safety and health of workers is about growing a culture, not simply developing a safety management program and then hoping it works. You have to feed it, care for it, so that it succeeds and continues to succeed. Really, all that comes down to what gets measured gets done. And I hope that you consider that as you really take away some lessons from today's presentation. So here's just another QR code for you. It takes you to our website where you can find a lot more information, download some of the white papers that we've produced on contractor management, on serious injuries and fatalities, and even some sustainability reports as well. I think probably is now a good time for me to open it back up to Andy for any questions that may have come through the Q&A or through the chat.
Yeah, we can do that, Ryan. We have had a few questions, which probably
Great.
won't surprise you. Great presentation. I was kind of reassured actually at the end when you talked about the main focus area to see safety and culture up there with profitability and cost, which is
Yes.
often seen as one of the main reasons to subcontract is to reduce your
Yep.
cost. To see safety considered as, if not more important than the cost element was quite reassuring. So we
Yes,
did get a
sir.
number of questions that have come in. So maybe I'll start with the first one we got, which it's a pretty focused question, but maybe I think it goes a bit broader to kind of equipment and contractors bringing their equipment onto site and working with their own equipment. How do you manage that? Is it through your due diligence, through kind of audit process? How do you kind of control that element of contractor management?
It's a great thing to allow contractors to bring their own equipment when it's possible. So I'm glad that it's even a challenge that you're facing, right? It's as you're talking about, Andy, it's one less thing for you to monitor yourself at your own organization. I think one of the best ways that we hear of companies being able to keep track of that is literally using some sort of check-in, check-out feature. And now it can be recognizing that this particular company is bringing on, a full-blown forklift, or maybe it's something smaller like a hand or power tool. But regardless, you want to make sure that those companies are able to provide the documentation to you in the event that you ask for it. Just as, when we were all growing up, you were scared of a pop quiz in class, right? It's the same thing here. Make your contractors scared that they're going to be pop quizzed on the equipment, and have that documentation ready to support it. So that when you do go out and do an audit on those companies and you say, show me your JSAs, show me your JHAs or your toolbox talk that you did this morning, you're going to be able to support that documentation with evidence that the equipment is in good working order, that it's been monitored at the appropriate frequency, et cetera, or calibrated is a very big one too. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. You also talked about, I think, quite early on, the different types of contractor, kind of different classes of contractors and their
Hmm.
risk profiles. Clearly, in some of our businesses, there are kind of more embedded contractors, people undertaking sort of not non-core works, but core works. I'm thinking things like slag management, more materials handling. There's a number of organizations who really are sitting permanently in the steel plant and doing that. How do you manage those kind of organizations? Is it different if they're there kind of all the time to other types of contractor?
Very fair question, and I think the answer is no. They're really no different than anybody else who may, check in and check out, 1 week at a time or only during, a turnover or something like that. If they're embedded, there's all the more reason to have them actively engaged in your safety, culture and performances. So it's one of those things when we talked about, communicating with contractors and engaging with them. Those folks that are on there day in and day out are probably some of the best ones to really think about that collaboration with. But in the end, in terms of monitoring and holding them to high expectations, they're just as important, if not more important, to hold them to those expectations of, making sure that they're not encountering any incidents, or they're not doing any risky behaviors without mitigation techniques in place. Use the ability, or use the collaboration as a technique to work with them to identify what they're seeing on your sites. Use one of those safety culture perception surveys, because I guarantee you those organizations embedded are going to have some of the most valuable things for you to know and understand, because they see it day in and day out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if you're trying to learn from incidents, but also learn from what goes well. Those guys are a great resource, right? They're in your
That's it.
plant. They do have a slightly different perspective on what you're doing. So,
That's it.
yeah, that's nice observation. We have another question. Maybe it's worth going back to, what you do with contractors who don't play ball. There's a question that came in, pointing at an example in Japan where they do seem, got another question, struggle with some, a subset of their contractors who just seem reluctant. I mean, short of ultimately, the answer is to go to somebody else, right? But how do you got any advice on how you communicate with those kind of companies to try and bring them along, or is it just a matter of, you can't do it, we need to find somebody else?
Yeah, fair. And it's one of those things, like I said, it's not something that you're aiming to make enemies out of, right? You don't want to burn bridges or ruin relationships with companies, especially if they've worked with your organization for many years, because sometimes those types of relationships can be more valuable to your organization in terms of success. One of the big ways, I think, is just talking with those companies. Like I was trying to say, figure out what is the root cause of them not being able or willing to meet the expectations that you've laid out. So if this year your focus was on safety and you've got a heavy focus on your serious injury fatalities reduction or regulatory citations and violations, Is it that this company can't monitor, doesn't want to report, right? If you kind of work with them to figure that out, then maybe you can help address or alleviate some of their concerns. You can say things like, hey, listen, I'm not trying to prevent you from coming on site by knowing your incident rate for the past 3 years, right? What I'm trying to do is establish that baseline so that we can work together to prevent injuries from occurring in the first place, right? And kind of talk to them about that proactivity. If instead it's cybersecurity and you say, well, this year, I'm not going to let you on my side if you don't have cybersecurity policies in place, and this company says not going to happen, right? Then you can again ask them, what is it about? Is it because you don't use computers, right? Is it because you don't have technology? In which case, maybe there's an exemption warranted for those expectations. More likely, though, it's that they don't see the need for it. And if you kind of come to them with some data to support your stance that says, hey, listen, contractors have been responsible for some of these biggest data breaches in the world over the past few years, which results in me and my company having to foot the cost to provide the mitigation efforts after that cybersecurity breach, right?
Yeah,
Hopefully those types of discussions kind of help them realize why you're after what you're after. It's not just to be mean, it's not just to be punitive, but there really is an end goal of driving, more safe, more sustainable companies to work for you and your organization. It's hard. There's not a silver bullet, but I think just as with most, person to person relationships, company to company relationships can really be enhanced through active communication.
yeah, it pays to talk. That makes a lot
It
of sense.
pays
I
to
mean, like we
talk.
always say that workers, don't come on the plant looking to get injured and not to
That's it.
comply. And I guess with organizations like this, they don't come onto plant to behave in dangerous ways, but we need to understand why they're taking those calls that they are. There's a lot of questions have come in, and we probably won't get
Good.
to all of them, but we'll do
That's
our
okay.
best. What about SMEs? I mean, there's different classes of contractors, both in terms of the risk they do and the type of organization. I guess a lot of SMEs will be more streamlined, smaller, perhaps don't have a lot of the skills and resources that your large, engineering type contractors would have. Do you need to deal with them differently? And how do you sort of tailor your approach to SMEs?
Yeah, the small and medium businesses are essential to our functioning economy, right? There's so many of them, and they do often specialized work. I mean, even when you look at the 80,000 companies that ISN has in our system, a third of those have fewer than 10 employees. So we are talking to a lot of these small and medium-sized businesses. In the end, because they are typically doing specialized work, the risks that they face and the risk that they bring to your company can be the same level as organizations that do have a lot more monetary support behind them, the ones that are thousands of employees that can kind of send people out left and right, right? They're facing the same types of hazards on a day-to-day basis, and it can bring a lot of detriment if something were to happen to your company. So I think it's important to consider those small and medium businesses in the same way that you do a lot of the big ones. Now,
Mm,
work with them, right? You can't expect them to have a full-time safety professional on staff that's going to come with them on site and do all of those types of, in-person assessments and audits. They just don't have the manpower, the personnel, the time to do such a thing. But if you work together to find out what's a good balance of the support that your company can provide, then chances are that working relationship will thrive. If you can provide them the training that they need to perform work successfully on your location, maybe you can subsidize their costs for training if you don't want to do it yourself. There's different ways to engage with those types of companies to show that you care about that relationship that you have with the organization and work with it to help it flourish, right? It's not all just about money, but money does
sure.
talk, of course. And so you're able to kind of support them in different ways that will encourage them to be a safe organization.
When we talk about working with our own people and safety management, kind of culture and how things are developed, the issue kind of penalizing people for working unsafely has very much come out of fashion, right? We don't talk about really penalizing people anymore. a number of questions have come up through the chat about, penalty clauses. How do you penalize contractors? What's your view on the role of, penal clauses and imposing penalties on contractors who don't comply and don't come up to your expectations? Is that okay in this context?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's the philosophy that I think probably people are alluding to, or maybe even explicitly calling out human and organizational performance or HOP, right? And there's a number of elements that go into a HOP mindset, one of which is that the employees themselves are not the ones at fault, right? You have to dig deeper and find out, okay, just because Bob got into an incident today on his fork truck doesn't mean that Bob was at fault necessarily, right? Was it that he didn't have the proper training to operate that fork truck? Was it that the fork truck didn't have, the proper alarms or sensors attached to it to kind of alert him to his surroundings or what was going on?
Or the
Right?
design of the job set him up to fail, right?
You got it, Andy. That's exactly right. And so in those cases, you want to dig deeper and find out what's the root cause and how can you prevent it from happening again. I think the same goes true for the company organizations, right? You don't want to necessarily blame the company, right? Do we need to design our work sites or our work products differently to not put that company in the situation in the first place? So when you have this kind of penalization conversation, right, we're talking about enforcements. I think it really varies a little bit on this situation because it depends on what you're incorporating into your qualification system. If it's just incidents, then maybe it is a little bit harder to penalize the company for having incidents, right? Because you want to evaluate
Sure.
what situations led to that. But if you're trying to penalize them for not being proactive in establishing some of their own safety policies or procedures or expectations, that's when it's easier to say, hey, listen, maybe there hasn't been anything that's happened yet, but you as an organization are not showing me that you're willing to be proactive. You as an organization have shown me that you want to kind of run cowboy and just do your own thing. And that's the time when it's, I think, easier to penalize the companies and say, you're not going to work with me unless you take some of these additional steps to be safe.
We're coming to the end of our time. I'm going to slip in one final question because I know we want to take a few minutes to talk about the next webinars that we are going to launch. Thank you, everybody, for your engagement. A couple of people have asked, are we going to share a copy of the presentation? Yes, we will take this presentation. We will convert it actually into a course, make it downloadable via SteelUniversity. One last question, Ryan, before we move on to the final piece. Quality of training for contractors, quickly. Given a credit card in 20 minutes, I can probably come up with a PhD and from a
Yeah.
dodgy online university. How do
Right.
we assess the quality of training of contractors? People can come up with bits of paper and certificates. How do we know if they're meaningful or just something,
The
gets paid?
documentation piece is step one, right? You do want to see at least that they even tried. Yes, they had a credit card, but at least they used it, right? At least they tried. But if you think back to kind of the funnel slide that I talked about earlier and the different sieve, really step three there is showing that you can do some sort of implementation audit or assessment on those companies. So you say, great, I recognize that you have a policy on fall protection. I recognize that you've shown me that you paid $20 for this course online. But let me actually talk to your employees and see if they understood that training, if they know what it means to work safely from heights and what it takes, right? What are the proper tie-off points? How to wear your harness correctly? What is an SRL? Those types of conversations can be had face to face, person to person, to help gauge the quality of the training that they've received, but also the retention of those employees who are receiving the training. That's what I would
Sure.
encourage. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. And as we round off our hour, maybe this is a good time to talk just for a minute about what's coming next.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again for joining today, the contractor management best practices. Do keep an eye out for some other ones we have upcoming from ISN this and World Steel this summer. So on-site monitoring is going to take place next on the 3rd of June, followed by HSE Plus, which really is a deep dive into that implementation assessment and different avenues that you can take, and that will be on the 15th of July. And then we'll close out, like I said, in September on the 9th of September with safety culture and benchmarking and doing a real deep dive into what that means of safety culture and how you can kind of compare yourself to others in the steel industry.
Fantastic. Some excellent topics, I think, to look forward to going forward. So I think that's probably a good point to draw things to a close. I don't know if you've got an ending slide, Ryan. There we
Not
go.
really. I just
So
wanted to say thank you. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for everybody who's been participating. Please keep an eye on World Steel socials and Steel University socials and website for more information on how to register for the future webinars. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Tim.